I clearly remember the night in 1990 when I witnessed something that would later change my perspective as a solo percussionist. I was watching the televised Henry Wood Proms in London, and playing at that exact time was an orchestral work that would change not only my life, but elevate the standing of solo percussion to a completely different level. The piece of music was the world premiere of The Confessions of Isabel Gowdy by a young Scottish composer, James MacMillan. Well, I was transfixed by the sheer power and the changing of gears and waves of scintillating sound colours, and of course the brilliance of each member of the orchestra. And at the end, I was left breathless from the experience, and I knew I had to be in contact with this composer to ask if he would consider writing a percussion concerto for me. Of course, the rest is history, and 1992 saw the arrival of one of our great percussion concertos, Veni Veni Emmanuel. It was the first ever percussion concerto to be performed in the history of the Proms. But James MacMillan was not a one or indeed two-piece wonder. The scope and magnitude of his compositions to date has meant that he is now regarded as one of the world's most prominent, important and sought-after composers. The kind of composer that in centuries to come, I feel sure people will still be experiencing and connecting with as an essential part of their lives. James, thank you so much for spending this time today with me.
You're very welcome. It's great to see you again. It's great to join you this morning.
Thank you very much. And we've known each other for about 30 years or so, but we don't actually see each other that much, do we, really? Because we're all here, there and everywhere.
That's right. And I suppose in these last few years, my life is, well, everyone's life has become more solitary. For a composer, it's no bad thing, I suppose. I mean, the solitariness is important. It allows you to focus on the music. But you know, I like you, I'm a jobbing musician, and all that has stopped for the moment, at least. And there's great anxiety and pain amongst the musicians. All my friends, for example, that whose life of music making has been cut short. I can just imagine what it's like for you as well. But I hope that better days are around the corner quite soon.
I think so. And I mean, I was going to ask you, this past year, of course, has changed the whole landscape for not just our industry, but you know, right across the globe. And I was just going to ask, what have been the pros and the cons from a composer's perspective? You know, having such a change in dynamic, as it were. What have been the advantages and perhaps the disadvantages?
Well, the advantages for me, I suppose, relate to the fact that I've written a lot of music, perhaps a lot more music than I thought I would. I've got through my work quicker than I thought. Hope that's a good thing. But it does mean that there's a whole range of pieces beginning to mount up. They've had their premiere dates. Those dates have come and gone, and the music has not been performed. So one hopes that the cancellations are not cancellations as such, but really just postponements. There are new dates coming through for rescheduled premieres, mostly next year, fingers crossed. But it does mean that, I mean, I moved away from the big city, Glasgow. I lived in Glasgow for decades, really. I moved out here to the North Ayrshire countryside about 5 or 6 years ago. Because of the quiet and because of the solace and because this remote house is very conducive to work. And that has continued very pointedly and intensely during the lockdown. The disadvantages, I suppose, I've hinted at it, is that the music making, the live music making, has come to a halt. You know, I have friends all over the world whose lives are on hold, who've had to change careers in some cases, and hopefully that won't be a a definite thing. Perhaps they will be able to come back to music making in the future, and I feel for them. So the disadvantage is this shared anxiety amongst us all about what on earth is going to happen next.
I can quite understand that. And do you think that the pandemic has, in a way, made you think about the type of pieces you might write for the future? I mean, obviously, a lot of the concerts that are given are pared down number-wise as regards to the musicians. So there's a lot more chamber pieces and smaller ensemble pieces being played because they can be socially distanced and so on. And do you think this is something that you might perhaps, you know, think about moving forward, writing for smaller forces or different combinations, or rethinking how an orchestra is engaged as regards to an audience, and thinking, what does an orchestra mean to our society in this very changed landscape?
Yes. Well, I mean, one of the events I was able to undertake recently was a performance, if that's the right word, of a new oratorio, a Christmas oratorio of mine. And I actually got to Amsterdam in January to perform it with quite large forces, no audience, of course, but the piece went out live on Dutch radio. And we did the performance in the Concertgebouw in Amsterdam. And what I noticed was it was a pared down orchestra, as pared down as we could manage, but chorus, a professional chorus of 36 voices, a couple of vocal soloists. But the difficulty was trying to, with all the social distancing, was trying to keep all those forces together, and just trying to get the ensemble absolutely right was such a struggle. And I get this from feedback from many musicians who even in smaller forces, because they've got to sit well apart, and even desk partners amongst the string players are not together, and how are they going to, but gradually they are overcoming those difficulties, and I think it will impact on general musicianship, perhaps. Playing as a solitary player rather than a desk partner in a string section requires a big step change in the mindset, and perhaps it will have a strangely beneficial impact on the way that we think. You know, a much more intense engagement with people round about us. And yes, I mean, I'm also aware that that numbers are being cut for these performances, these audience-less performances, and it is impacting on the way that we think about orchestra. My mind has started turning back to chamber music again. I've neglected my chamber music in recent years, and it was a joy to be able to get to write a string quintet in these last few months, for example, and I'd like to do more of that. I also run a festival in Scotland, the Cumnock Trist, and we had to postpone, well, cancel completely last year, and we're now thinking ahead how we're going to do that with social distancing in the audience, but also what kind of groups we bring to the festival in Cumnock. And obviously there will be smaller groups for some time. We don't know how long that will be, but it also means that we've had to think more locally. And perhaps this is a growing advantage, that we are turning back to thinking about what we can do for our communities more, and what musicians in the locale can bring to those communities. International travel has been hit, of course, and that is affecting all our plans. I know that conductors are not able to get to concerts here, for example, so orchestras are taking on board local conductors and local soloists, perhaps more than usual. And maybe that will focus our minds on the importance of the locality, the importance of the local community which we serve, and that's something that we at the Cumnock Trist may regard as an advantage in some way, that we focus our intense thoughts on what our community needs culturally, what our community needs locally. And that might be a good thing.
And it's really interesting because I'd like to talk about the Cumnock Trist whole initiative in a little while. But it's interesting what you're saying about tapping into our communities again, because there's been such a heavy discussion and push towards music education, arts education, over many, many years now. And I think perhaps you and I are of the generation whereby we really benefited from the immense richness in school education, school music education that we had. I believe we both had really rich landscapes, both within the school and also in the community. And but of course that's sometimes quite patchy nowadays, and perhaps being a believer in kind of a yin and yang situation, that although we're experiencing very dark days at the moment, there has to be some positives out of this. And it might be that through the lack of international travel and performances, as we've known, that perhaps looking closer to home might inject that sort of real inspiration for our communities, our young people, what music means within the family, social situation, etc., etc. So it may not be such a bad thing.
Well, I know that many musicians involved in music education up here in Scotland have a kind of galvanising approach now to making music work more in their communities, and we've perhaps been able to speak more directly to those in power about the need to focus on the very young in our communities, to get music education back as one of the basics again, because I think you're right, there has been a sense of drift, both north and south of the border, and the great experiences for people like us in the 1970s and 80s and so on of learning music at school and not forcing our parents to pay for music lessons too much. Those days have gone, or at least are looking very precarious, and it would be a great scandal if it was just the well-off, because they were able to afford music lessons, that were able to benefit from music provision. And those of us involved in music in the community, music in education, have been re-galvanized in telling that story to those in power, speaking truth to power, as they say, and making them remember that this is so important. A life without music, an education without music, is an education and a life impoverished. And not everyone is going to be a professional musician, but to go through a school life without being involved and exposed to music in all its forms is a great dereliction of education, if that's allowed to happen. And I think we're looking at the possibility of that happening more and more for a lot of young people, and that would be a great mistake. It would be an assault on the educational opportunities of the young, and it's allowed us to renew those arguments to government and to the politicians and so on, that perhaps in the middle of this lockdown and a pandemic, we can start really focusing on the basics again.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, what has a pandemic revealed something about you as a person that perhaps has surprised you?
Oh,
there, I put you on the spot, James.
Yes. Well, I think I've always felt and always thought that the interior life was the important life. And I suppose being a composer or any reflective person generally, one has to believe that, and one has to focus on that. But sometimes you can lose sight of what it actually means. And an enforced silence like this, an enforced restriction where you don't see people, where you don't get to work with your peers. It forces you back in on yourself, whether we like it or not. But there has been a great cultural hinterland in our civilization and in our history of people, not just artists and musicians, but thinkers and spiritual people as well, one way or another, that have gone deep into the interior life of contemplation, of meditation, and in the Judeo-Christian experience, the world of prayer. And it's in that interior life that perhaps one finds the real essence of what it means to be human. There are hardships involved in that interior life if it means a lessening of social activity. Of course, that's the case. If we lose our connection with our peers, if we don't see our friends and family, that is a real loss to us. But there are perhaps some compensations in that we're allowed that scope and time to go deeper into the serious things in our thinking, and what it means to be human. And it's certainly given us a lot of time to reflect on those deeper truths. And for a composer or any artist, these are essential moments, these are essential reflections. And perhaps we will all emerge emboldened and strengthened through these restrictions in the end. At least that, I keep my fingers crossed that will be the case.
Absolutely. And I mean, I've read your wonderful book, I have to say, A Scots Song, A Life of Music. It's a real gem, and I'd highly recommend everybody reading this book, whether you're a musician or otherwise. And it's very thought-provoking and very moving in places, and especially when you describe the very special relationship and bond that you had and actually still have spiritually with your granddaughter Sarah, who passed away a few months before her 6th birthday a few years ago now. But I think one question that composers are asked is who or what do they compose for? Is it for themselves, the public? Is it an event, an occasion, a landscape, a painting? What is it? And one of the things that I very much felt from this book is that the music you write is pertaining to your journey and all that you've experienced and the many people that you've encountered, but also the very deep listening experiences that you allow yourself through reflection and the thinking and the digesting of your thoughts in relationship to events in the world. And do you think that it's possible to write a piece without having a more personalized reason to it, if that makes sense? I've kind of asked that question quite clumsily, but hopefully you'll see the essence of it. Or do you think you can start with a blank sheet of paper and think, right, I'm going to write a piece for trumpet or percussion or piano, and in a way write for the instrument as opposed to getting away from the instrument and giving that experience?
Well, it's a very good question, and it's something I confront as many musicians and composers do all the time. Who is your audience is also part of that question. I think, who am I writing for? Who does a composer write for when he writes music? And there have been many different answers to this over the centuries and generations. Yes, of course, music is a social activity. It would be a strange music indeed if no one ever heard it, or if it simply existed within the mind's ear of the composer. So there has to be a kind of social dimension to writing music. But the music does have to come from a very special place and a very unique place that only the individual composer can create. And but in that dichotomy, is it just for me, or is it for the world? There are a lot of tensions and a lot of ambiguities, And I sometimes think, and as you're probably aware, Evelyn, and as our listeners are aware, there have been, especially maybe in the last century or so, a lot of questions about the nature of modern music, which is sometimes regarded as esoteric and difficult and hard to understand sometimes. And there's been a hinterland, a kind of historical hinterland behind that. As composers, especially in the beginning of the 20th century, some of them at least began to move away from their audience and began to think that the audience didn't have the capacity, one way or another, intellectually to understand what they were doing. Quite an arrogant attitude when you think about it. But we have to remember that the likes of Schoenberg, and a composer I admire greatly, nevertheless, he and his colleagues established a society for the private performance of new music. Well, why a private society for new music? Well, it's because that they, and only they, were able to understand the music, and that the audience out there didn't have that intellectual capacity. And that introversion, if you like, has coloured the history of modern music, you could say, to such an extent that even today, you'll still get these conversations and questions. Who is a composer writing for? Is it for me and the likes of me, the musical intelligentsia, fellow composers, critics, musicologists? Well, I would be very upset if it was just them. I have an idea that the music does have to have a generosity of spirit, that you can speak to the uninitiated. You can speak, even with the most complex of means and sounds, you can communicate with people that may not know much about the world of esoteric modern music. And some of my most exciting and life-affirming moments were when those moments happened. Like, for example, and you've made a reference to it already, an audience who didn't know who I was heard the percussion concerto I wrote for you, Veni Veni Emmanuel, for the Proms in 1992. That was an audience of 5,000 plus, and they weren't the aficionados, they weren't the musical insiders, as it were. Maybe some of them were, but the vast majority were not. There were people that were there because of an innate curiosity and a love for music generally. And it might have been because of a love of older music that brought them there. They didn't know what they were going to hear from you or from me. And that interaction and that possibility inspires me. I suppose if I was to answer the question, who is my audience? Who do I write for? I would have to say that I have an ideal listener in mind. And this is where I may sound a little bit arrogant, I don't want to, but that ideal listener is someone a bit like me. And what I mean by that, to counteract the arrogance, is that my ideal listener is someone who is thirsty and hungry for music they don't yet know. And that's a lot of very different kinds of people. But I'm keen that people who are open to the possibility of being inspired or moved or excited by new things, as yet unheard things, are out there. Are out there in their multitudes. And my experience of musical life is that that's the case. They're not the intelligentsia per se, they're not the insiders, they're not the new music ghetto, as we sometimes refer to it. They're a wide group of people. We also know that in classical music there are people who are not curious, and we have to kind of accept that. There are people who know what they like and like what they know, and they tend not to be open to the new. But even there, the opportunity for conversion, if you like, is there. You can convince people who may be quite difficult to convince that there is something worthwhile and indeed even exciting or indeed moving in the making of modern music. So your question is very complex, Evelyn, and it invites many, many complex answers. but my aspiration is to reach a wide group of people. Sometimes they are being convinced for the very first time that modern music is something for them.
But I think also, with the explosion of social media, it is allowing people to be exposed in different ways to our living composers and indeed our composers of the past. And that surely must be a good thing. I suppose that the thing that I struggle slightly with is that, when you experience your pieces in a live situation, it is an experience. Every sense is fulfilled. That guttural kind of physical sensation of the sound, and it's a very different experience watching something on your laptop or on an iPad or whatever it is. You're not getting that bodily experience, but nevertheless, it might just still plant a seed, towards someone's curiosity, thinking, oh, well, that was interesting. I'd like to know more about James MacMillan's music, or, something like that.
Yes, you can't beat the live experience. And I think part of the musical education that we were talking about earlier has to be getting those young people into a concert hall and hearing an orchestra, sometimes for the first time. Sometimes it doesn't really matter what the orchestra is playing, but just the experience of being up close to such a miraculous sensation, a miraculous invention as an orchestra, or indeed a wonderful choir or a virtuosic soloist. It can be a life enhancing, a life-changing moment. So the young people need to be brought to the live musical performance, or indeed the live musical performance has to go to them. And that's why we at the Cumnock Trice, for example, work very closely with the schools in Ayrshire, not just bringing great musicians in to work with them and to play for them, but maybe to get the youngsters playing alongside these great musicians. It's a fabulous experience when you see that interaction.
And do you feel, or have you noticed a difference, because music is quite patchy in our schools and communities at this precise moment? I mean, have you noticed a difference in the music that's being written by our young people, because it might be more digitally oriented, because they don't have access to musicians in their schools, or a school orchestra, or a school band, or choir, or whatever it might be? It may not be available in the community and so on. Are you finding differences there? Because surely with this incredible initiative that you set up with Cumnock Trice, that this has got to be a great thing, for young musicians experiencing real music and finding out, oh heavens, trying to balance a violin with a timpani or a cello and a trumpet or something, which you can do digitally, but it might be more challenging with the real thing, as it were.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. The digital experience has been great in many ways for many, and in music, of course, it allows you to make music almost immediately in your bedroom sometimes, or in your study at home, and of course it helps the whole self-publishing industry as well. You can make your own music through the whole Sibelius apparition equipment and so on, which is great. However, we are finding, and I've certainly found that digital sound is very unreal, and it gives a very unreal perception to the young musician of what their music might be like. And certainly I've found this not just working with student composers at colleges and universities, but even now in secondary schools, that the digital experience is something that has to be absorbed, but has to be transcended as well. Don't just rely on it. Imagine this music being played by either your peers or your teachers or visitors. So we see it as important that we do get real musicians, live professional musicians in amongst them to play their music so that they can hear their music in workshops. We also are quite traditional in the way that we are traditionalist in the way that we teach composition. Yes, the improvisational experience is important, making music from scratch on the spot, in the moment. Yes, of course, that's great to be able to feel instinctively what music can do. But we're also determined to stress the importance of skills, traditional skills like notation. It's really important to be able to write your ideas down, and that requires a lot of intense engagement. Sometimes an intense one-to-one engagement that hard-pressed teachers can sometimes find difficult to bring to the individual student experience. So when we are able to get to schools, a couple of composers suddenly arriving in the class, we're able to work one-to-one with the students, and you can begin to see things crystallize much more immediately in that one-to-one experience. Just because there are cuts in education shouldn't mean that one-to-one experience, which was so important for us, and whatever we did, learning percussion instruments, learning trumpet, as I was a trumpeter, or indeed learning from another composer, it's unbeatable. It's absolutely necessary. So we need to bring that experience to the table in the teaching we do at the composition teaching, the Covenant Christ. And so we're training student composers to learn with us and to come with us, because they will be the teachers of the next generation. And we need to get more composers, young student composers in their early 20s, for example, being able to interact and encourage composers in their teens. And that's something that we're trying to build on as we establish more and more our activities at the Covenant Christ.
Why has it been important for you to remain in Scotland? And what is it about Scotland that inspires you, and you feel that your music might have been different if you had decided to locate somewhere else?
Yes, that's an interesting question. And over the years, I would have had very different answers for it. At one point, I would have answered by saying it doesn't really matter where I am, I'd still write the music I needed to write. I've certainly modified my response. I think for a long while I would have said my wife wanted to be in Scotland. She preferred to be here, and therefore I would prefer to be here. And then of course children come along, and bringing children up and getting them to school, they need that security, and they need to be settled. So life takes a momentum of its own. But then gradually over the years, I began to notice that I think my music is shaped by place, and many composers' lives are. And I suppose my reluctance to acknowledge that might have been something to do with what some in the arts would see as the limiting nature of localism. You can argue that localism breeds nationalism or parochialism. There's all these kind of accusations have been thrown around many of us, but there are accusations and comments that have been made or comments that have been made about many composers, especially through the 19th century. But when you think about it, that localism, that focus on where you are and who you are, has been important for many composers. It just took me a longer while than most to realise that was the case, and that the music was being shaped by place and maybe character of place. I think that some of my work does reflect something of this country. In your introduction, you mentioned a piece I wrote over 30 years ago, The Confession of Isabel Gowdy. That's a kind of tone poem, if you like, an orchestral tone poem that paints a picture or tells a story about a real woman, a real event that happened here in Scotland, not too far from where you're from, actually,
Yes.
up at Aldern in the north of Scotland. A woman who was accused of being a witch and has been celebrated or commemorated in many of the arts, including pop songs and the visual arts. And maybe I wouldn't have written that piece if I wasn't from Scotland. Maybe I needed to be here and Scottish in order to really engage with a true Scottish story. And then I've written music about Iona. But even in the works that don't necessarily reflect or mention where I'm from, I think in retrospect I can feel a kind of flavour of the place. And some of that is Scottish, some of it is British. I mean, the great British composers of the 20th and 20th century have also been, English composers have been a big influence in me as well, sometimes without me knowing it.
And I think it's interesting because in your book, A Scots Song, A Life of Music, you mentioned how you engaged with traditional Scottish groups, folk groups, as a whistle player and as a singer and so on, but how you mentioned that you listened so intently as regards to the subtleties of what they did, just all those little things that make this kind of music so special. And that really interested me because it's that deep listening that you have towards yourself, towards other, and then how you can almost make this a seamless pathway and therefore create a bridge for your audiences. And I think that's so interesting, really. And perhaps that's why I also asked the question, is that, Scotland is such a giving place. The landscape is so giving. It really is. The people are so interesting. The dialects, the language, just everything about Scotland and the inventions that have come from Scotland and the arts, and it goes on and on and on. But musically, it's still very much alive in a traditional sense.
Yes, I got very interested in Scottish traditional music when I was in my 20s. As many Scottish composers have done over the years, I can cite a number of them, like Judith Weir, for example, the Master of the Queen's Music. And she sometimes references Scottish traditional music. Peter Maxwell Davies did that as well with his use of the bagpipes, but also his awareness of Scottish traditional ornamentation and so on. And some of my old friends from Glasgow, like William Sweeney, who wrote this wonderful choral piece called Salamoniering, which is Gaelic for Psalm of the Land, where you could hear the influence of Gaelic psalm singing. And that was a revelation as well. Lyle Cresswell, who's actually from New Zealand, one of his early pieces was an orchestral piece called Sam, again referencing what happens there and that incredible sound of the cantor leading the congregation in a kind of ornamented line. Edward Maguire, who was a member of the Whistlebinkies, the folk group, and he worked and played traditional music all his life. That got under the skin of his music, and I took my lead from that, and I joined folk bands when I was a young man and played around about the folk clubs and the bars in the west of Scotland, playing whistle, as you say, and singing and keyboard and so on. And I picked up a lot from my colleagues some of whom were pipers or traditional folk singers. And without me realizing it, a lot of that influence was indeed being absorbed and going under the skin of the music. And to begin with, I would perhaps do it deliberately, try to evoke those musical memories, but eventually I did it so much that I was doing it without knowing it. I was doing it subconsciously, and it became part of the fabric of the music making. And even today, when I don't play a lot of folk music anymore, I can still hear and see those influences emerging. And I speak to singers, choral singers, who are always talking about the ornamentation in my motets and choral music, and they find it quite hard to do. That kind of little shake, diddly-hum, diddly-hum, that you sometimes get, and that comes naturally to Scottish fiddle music, or indeed the pibroch players. I'm doing it in my choral music, and it takes a little bit of getting used to, and trying to get a whole section of tenors, for example, to do an ornament together is similar to getting a whole section of violins and an orchestra to do it. It's got to be worked at. It doesn't come naturally to classical players, especially if they're not Scottish or Irish. If they're at the other end of the world, how do they accommodate that? But it can be done, and it's certainly a talking point among musicians.
It's interesting because I remember as a little girl in primary school, we all did Scottish country dancing, and then of course I started percussion from the age of 12 and did a lot of the Scots style of snare drumming. But it was only when I started playing the bagpipes in my 20s that suddenly the dancing and the snare drumming all made sense. And it was almost this triangle that had happened. And so all of the little twiddly notes that happen on the pipes really are so connected with the little flams and drags and ornamentation on the snare drum, and therefore the footwork with the dancing. And it is quite interesting how it took so many years for this penny to drop in a way. But I think, what I find inspiring about all of this is, through the Come Not Christ initiative, it's a wonderful way, I would imagine, to bring young people who are perhaps more interested in the traditional music, but want to be part of this whole, journey that you've provided for young people, and not feel excluded, because you have really embraced that, traditional landscape as well.
Yes, I find it a very useful way of building bridges between different kinds of musicians. The barriers come down once you realise that we all share certain experiences and enthusiasms. And I think that's important, especially in classical music, which in many ways has maintained a very broad interest over the centuries. You can trace an interest in the music of the people right back through the 19th century, and even before that. Mozart and Beethoven were interested in folk music. Haydn set text by Robert Burns, and so did Beethoven. The connections between high art music, if you like, and vernacular music is well established, and that should continue, and it continues with other vernacular musics, if you like, pop music and jazz. And Stravinsky was interested in what the jazz musicians in the States were doing in the 20s and 30s and 40s, and he picked up a lot of that, and so it goes on. I think it's important that in our dialogues with young musicians that we keep inspiring them to find out more about music they don't know. And for a lot of them, they've succumbed to the old and tired arguments that classical music isn't for them, and classical music is elitist, and trying to dissuade them from that can be a bit of a battle, but it's a worthwhile battle, because if they open their ears to one form of music that is outside their own little path, they suddenly find themselves interested in lots of other things. And although music is more available now than ever before, at the click of a switch, you can hear a whole range of music from the past and from the other side of the world. Nevertheless, we live in a culture which likes us to keep in our lanes more than ever, and that is a problem. Trying to get young musicians to think outside the box that has been laid down for them, and it's not just about classical music. I find a lot of my conversations with these young musicians is try and listen to music that young people in India, for example, young people your age in India or in Indonesia are listening to, music of their culture. What does that say to you? So then they start listening to gamelan music, or the Indian ragas, or Korean farmer drumming, or whatever. You know, the kind of music that, in a sense, because of our interest in ethnomusicology, as it was once called, we found it important to know about. And you know, when I say to them, as well as listening, as well as learning and knowing about Scottish traditional music or the latest pop singers, what about Mongolian Tuvan throat singing? Make that an exercise this week, that you go onto YouTube and listen to that for the first time, and then they're astonished by what they hear. And then the next week, well, try a Shostakovich symphony, just to be outside the box. And I think it's important that music education is wide as well as focused.
And I suppose it's almost thinking of this as a timeline, you know, what was the music throughout the world in the, well, you know, whenever, 16th century or 17th century or whenever, you know, 21st century. So what is happening in China? What is happening in Africa? What is happening in Latin America? What is happening in Scotland? And see all the variations and see how that has changed. So just as we learn to read a score, you know, vertically as well as horizontally, I guess maybe it's opening up our listening to the music of the world, but almost in a timeline type of way, and it's absolutely fascinating. And I know that someone like Jacob Collier, whom I've spoken to in the past, you know, has revealed just how incredible it was with his upbringing, where his mum would just sort of say, "Oh, listen to this. Oh, listen to this. Listen to this," and it was the most eclectic, you know, things that he was given to listen to without them being categorized. And I think that was quite interesting. And so he has this just wonderful openness to what he does. But just moving on a little bit, James, because I'm very conscious that I'm taking up a fair amount of your time. And I've got so many questions. But what is the best moment in the process of having a new piece realized? So is it getting to the finishing line as far as getting it all notated and all the parts sorted out? Is it the first rehearsal? Is it the world premiere? Is it 100 performances down the road? What is that moment when you think, oh gosh, that just gives me such joy? You know what I mean? Or are you ultra critical? You know, do you find that, oh gosh, I really struggle hearing my own pieces? Or are you always nitpicking at things? I don't know what the process is with you.
The actual writing process is all embracing, it's all involving, it takes over your life. Sometimes it's joyful, sometimes it's not, sometimes it's a real struggle. You have to be critical, self-critical, making decisions that will affect not just the flow of the music, the evolution of the music, but let's say the quality of the music as well. So perhaps a burst of compositional activity will produce a lot of material, but then in reflection, and those reflections are vital, you realise that some of it is flawed, maybe all of it is flawed, and it needs to be revisited in some way. And those can be dispiriting moments, but they're absolutely vital to the process, and that you revisit almost immediately your choices and your decisions, subject them to, you know, a middle-aged composer like me doesn't have a teacher anymore, and I sometimes wish I did have a teacher looking over my shoulder telling me, maybe you need to rethink your steps there. You have to do that yourself now. So all that is part of the process, and although it's not necessarily joyful, you realise that it's making the music better. It's shaping the music in a particular way, and the reflection process is all-consuming. It can take over your lives, and sometimes in a way that allows you to focus on nothing else. And that can have its problems. You know, if your living and sleeping moments are dominated by the task at hand, the issues that have to be faced. That can be good and bad.
Yes, so are deadlines important for you? Does that help you focus, or do you like a free sort of time on things?
Deadlines are very useful. They have an effect on the adrenaline sometimes, and force you to make decisions. But once a double bar goes on a piece, it's a moment of elation, I would say, and celebration. Usually get some champagne out or something after the completion of a big piece. But it's all still in the head. It's all still in the brain, in the memory, and there's nothing quite matches the excitement of hearing the music come alive at a first rehearsal, when the music is suddenly in the hands of other people and they're making it come alive in their own way, in their own hands, in their own flesh. And it's a bit like the difference between, I mean, this is showing our age, I suppose, Evelyn, but in our day, we had, before photographs were digitalized, you took a photograph and you had a black and white negative, and you had to take that negative along to the chemists to get it made into Technicolor. And the difference between having that music in your brain and hearing it for the first time is a bit like the difference between your black and white negative, which is complete in itself, but not quite fully fleshed out in Technicolor, and then seeing the photograph in full Technicolor, which is what happens when you hear the music being played. And there's an immense excitement about that transition. And the first rehearsal is vital, but obviously the first performance is very exciting too.
It's a great way of describing it, a really nice analogy there. And yes, I do remember that process, and then the excitement of Polaroid cameras, where it was instant cameras, or whatever they were called.
Yeah.
But anyway, I mean, have there been, just on a more funny note, have there been pieces of music in that first rehearsal where you felt absolutely, oh my gosh, that's not at all what I thought I'd written, or it's actually much more positive than you thought? Have there been big highs or lows in that department?
Well, it's a while now since I've had a negative response to the first performance, and that's something that comes with age, I suppose. If you're a young composer, you can sometimes be surprised by what you've done. But part of the education process and the growing and the maturing is coming to terms with what is on the page, so that first encounter is not the surprise or the shock that it is sometimes for the young composer. I have sometimes more recently been in situations where I didn't recognize my own music. I walked into a rehearsal just a few years ago, actually, and because I try to stick to deadlines, and those deadlines are sometimes well in advance, sometimes a year, up to a year in advance of first performance, you forget about what you've done. And I wandered into a rehearsal, and it took me a little while to realise, oh, that's my music, which is quite strange, I suppose. But there has to be a kind of necessary forgetting when you put the double bar on a piece of music, because the next piece beckons, the next piece becomes the priority. You have to forget everything you've done, and it's a very strange and mysterious moment when everything that has existed in your mind collapses almost immediately, dissolves. It's a strange feeling that everything that has kept you alive for months, sometimes years, it really feels like in an instant dissolves. It's a very strange experience, but it's a necessary forgetting, because the mind has to be refreshed, the soul has to be refreshed, the compositional instinct and imagination has to be refreshed. The new task is at hand. And that's why I say, when I come to a piece that I've written a year previously as an interpreter, it's sometimes like learning a brand new score for the first time. It's like learning a piece I've never seen before. And that's important too, because you can't come at your own music with any preconceptions. You've got to learn it objectively, learn it afresh objectively, with new ears, new eyes.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And of course, you tell the story in your book about working with Sir Colin Davis, and I believe it was he who mentioned to you, well, you know, why don't you consider conducting? And that's interesting because, you know, you mentioned, well, you had no really aspirations to be on a conductor's podium and so on, and you needed a lesson, and you asked him for a lesson, and which was a really interesting experience. But how has this journey of being a conductor, because you're hugely respected as a conductor in your own right, and of course you're very supportive of uh, other composers' music, composers who are alive, and but how has that experience helped you as a composer?
Mm. Yes, well, I had no intention of conducting for years. I mean, I dabbled in it even from at primary school. I was just the one that was that needed to organise people together. I suppose there has to be a kind of organisational instinct with a conductor. You
Mm.
just get people gathered together to do this, and I certainly had that. Although I never really took it very seriously, um, and I was well into my 30s really before someone said you should do this in a more focused way.
Mm.
Um, and I had some great advice along the way, including from Sir Colin Davis. But you know, I suddenly realised, you know, I had to step up. I've never really had a composition. I've never really had a conducting lesson in my life, apart from that one encounter with Colin Davis. I've sometimes surreptitiously sneaked into rehearsals, of course, by the great conductors, and my great friend Martin Brabants has allowed me to
Oh,
sit at the back of some of his master classes.
amazing.
It's been great to observe something like that. But you know, I did a bit of a belated apprenticeship through my 30s and 40s, really, you know, scuttling off to little places and trying things out with orchestras that, you know, where I wouldn't be noticed too much, and learning technique and so on. But because I needed to do that, you know, I remember. I think what turned my mind towards this was that, again, this piece, The Confession of Isabel Gaudy, it was a few years old when the Philharmonia Orchestra decided to do it, and Giuseppe Sinopoli, who was the conductor at the time, was going to do it, and at the Royal Festival Hall. And I got a call at the beginning of that week from the manager of the Philharmonia, and basically said, look, James, Maestro Sinopoli hasn't learned the piece. Would you come down and do it in the middle of this concert? And at that stage, I had never been in the Royal Festival Hall before.
Oh,
I don't think, I certainly had never conducted a London orchestra. I'd conducted a few orchestras, but without taking it very seriously and taking me very seriously. I said, yes. So at the end of that week, I was in the Royal Festival Hall conducting The Confession of Isabel Gaudy in front of a big audience, and something just kind of, I wouldn't say snapped, but twigged overnight. And I said, yes, this is something that is important, and it's something I should be doing. And gradually, I've evolved my own strategies. I wouldn't do everything. I do a lot of my colleagues' music, as you say, living and dead. I think I have an insight into my colleagues' music that they appreciate. They know that they have someone on, a collaborator, if you like, an ally with a composer at the helm, and
mm,
I think that's appreciated. But you know, I've evolved some standard repertoire as well. There's certain things I like doing, some things I won't do. Life is short, and
yeah.
so I've established a kind of niche area as a composer who does these kind of things and not those kind of things, and it seems to work.
And it very much seems to work, but has it given you a different perspective of your own pieces? Because I know over the years you and I have collaborated on Veni Veni
Mm.
Emmanuel,
Mm-hmm.
and in your own compositions when you have to conduct them, Do you look at the score and think, who on earth wrote that, or why on earth did I
Yeah.
write that, or something?
Oh, very much so. And there's it's given me an insider's view of the making of music, which is essential. It's not a total prerequisite. I mean, there are composers, of course, who aren't conductors, and perhaps not even instrumentalists of note, that can still write great music. And sometimes something very strange and wonderful happens. And for example, Poulenc was not a singer. Poulenc was not au fait really with the workings of choirs, but he's given us this wonderful repertoire of beautiful but rather strange choral music. And you can tell it's not a singer that's making it. You can feel the hands going down on chords at a piano with that music. But it's nevertheless, it's something that's wonderful. But I would say that having a player's eye or an insider's eye on the performance of music has been absolutely invaluable. And I sometimes look at early works and say, yes, that is BC, that is my music before conducting. And there's certain things I wouldn't do now. There are things in the Confession of Isabel Gaudia and even Veni Veni Emmanuel that are difficult, and perhaps with a conductor's perspective, I would do differently. It doesn't make them less effective as music, though. But certainly, there's something happens when you go onto that podium when you say, that's how they work. That is, I think, that's very important.
It's interesting that, and from a soloist point of view, when you have the composer and also being the conductor, it's like, doubly stressful. But nevertheless, and of course, we have to talk a wee bit more about Veni Veni Emmanuel, because it's, it's been such a stalwart of a piece, not just within the percussion world, but in the music world as a whole. And can you remember all those years ago what your thoughts were when you were asked to write a percussion concerto?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, I was delighted that I was asked.
You don't have to say that, James.
And I was aware of other concertos that you had commissioned beforehand. The one that really got to me and made me really think, I want to do this, was Dominic Muldowney's concerto, which you don't really hear very much these days, but I was struck by the mechanism. I saw you play it, heard you play it in London and elsewhere, and it was obviously very hard, and the musicians had click tracks and earphones and so on, but there was something about it that drew me in. And of course, there have been many other great concertos as well. But I remember thinking, I'd like to do this. But the task is, how on earth do you balance what in essence is an orchestra of percussion instruments, if you want to use all those things, with a real orchestra, and very much an orchestra of the 19th century, an orchestra that hasn't really changed very much since Brahms's day. And perhaps alongside my music, that orchestra would perform the works of Brahms or Beethoven and so on. So there's a kind of strange clash of instrumental colours and cultures. There is this 19th century classical orchestra with this orchestra of sounds that have, in essence, have evolved throughout the 20th century. The 20th and 21st centuries is when the percussion department, the percussion section of an orchestra grew. And we think back to the early 1900s, and it might have been timps and a bass drum and a triangle that a lot of composers were working with, and then gradually all these other things began to emerge through our openness to other cultures, through Debussy hearing gamelan music at the Paris Exposition in the late 19th century, and so on. And gradually all these instruments, which in essence have their roots in other parts of the world and indeed other cultures, in India, the Far East, Africa, South America. They've evolved into the percussion section and indeed the percussion orchestra. So making those two worlds meld was my task.
And I mean, and sorry to interrupt, because in a way you had used percussion so extensively in your orchestral pieces before Veni Veni and in the chamber pieces and so on. I mean, percussion was a real force in your music even prior to Veni Veni.
Yes, yes, very much so. It was it had become very much an essential part of the orchestral palette in the music that I wrote. I've been very excited. I had been very excited about using percussion, tuned and untuned, in works like The Confession of Isabel Gaudier, and that continues. But it was important for me in this concerto for you, Evelyn, that I found something that allowed the unity to take place. And for me, that was this little figure from the Veni Veni Emmanuel chant, O come, Emmanuel. And in the chorus, those of you who know your Advent hymns will know that in the chorus it goes, rejoice, rejoice, just those bum, 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 just those two notes, but also there's a pulse there, short, long, short, long. There's a rhythmic element to that. And that became the kind of rhythmic, but also thematic DNA of the music. And in almost every bar of Veni Veni Emmanuel, you'll notice whether you as a soloist or somewhere in the orchestra, there's this little bum, 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 a kind of human heartbeat, in fact, which completely relates to the purpose of the piece, which was to reflect the incarnation, which was the idea of God becoming man.
And it's funny when you think about historically, you know, percussion was often seen as the devil kind of sound world, you know, in religious music, and not all religions, of course. And here we are dealing, you know, with a percussion concerto where the percussion and all the sound colors and the attacks and the resonances and so on is at the fore. And so, did you feel? I mean, had that crossed your mind, or was it more the fact that percussion is so innate in us all, you know, that the physicality of not just playing percussion, but of receiving the percussion sound and that resonance, you know, whether it's from a low tom-tom or a vibraphone or a tam-tam or bells, or was it the instruments themselves or the actual journey of the sound that, or the large frequency range, or what was happening there?
I think it's something to do with the fact that a lot of these instruments do come originally from vernacular cultures, folk cultures, whether it be our folk background, traditional music of Scotland. I don't think I actually wrote a bodhrán into your piece, but I have used the bodhrán in other works. But you know, these other drums and so on, they have their roots in dancing, that dance cultures of many different civilizations, including our own, and jazz music and pop music and so on. And it's that viscerality, as you say, that is always exciting in percussion music, and brings something very special to the world of art music, if you like, too.
That's true. And I mean, after you had written that piece, because it received such an incredible ovation, and the longevity of it has really been so incredibly special, and so many performers from around the world have really embraced this piece of music. But what did you learn about percussion, having written the percussion concerto, because you've since written a second percussion concerto, and I'm just interested to know, well, did you have to almost forget about Veni Veni, or did you feel that no, that was a vehicle to then extend into a second percussion concerto?
Well, I would never been able to rethink the whole idea if it hadn't been for Veni Veni, and the experience of writing Veni Veni has impacted so much on everything I've written for orchestra. But when I wrote my second percussion concerto, I needed to have a very different character. I had to rethink the whole thing. It had to be a very different sound world, new instruments, perhaps different instruments, and perhaps a different kind of approach to the mood. There was no point in writing, retracing my steps. I had to be significantly separate from Veni Veni, and I think there was a 20, 30, maybe between 20 and 30 years between the two works, which is just about time enough to distance myself from what it meant to write Veni Veni and move into a different kind of mental space for the second piece.
And that's actually quite a long time when you think about it, which is amazing. And we're just so grateful that we all do have this second percussion concerto available to us.